He's been depressed. All of a sudden, he can't do anything.
Why are you depressed, Alvy?
Tell Dr. Flicker. It's something he read.
Something you read, huh?
The universe is expanding.
The universe is expanding?
Well, the universe is everything, and if it's expanding, someday it will break apart, and that will be the end of everything.
What is that your business? He stopped doing his homework.
What's the point?
What has the universe got to do with it? You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding.
It won't be expanding for billions of years yet, Alvy. And we've got to try and enjoy ourselves while we're here, huh? Huh?
Again, you're getting sleepy. Your eyelids are getting heavy again. You are going into a deep trance again. Buongiorno here. Now that the actual hypnosis thing is applicable due to the fact that we are finally, after all this time, going to get into psychoanalytic criticism, I thought I would just milk that for all it was worth. And, you know me. I'm wacky. A lot of things that we have to get into today. And, want to go over some bullet points first. Some bullet points that are speeding upon us like a freight train out of nowhere. First thing being, just a heads up, book reports are going to be due next Monday. I'm going to definitely be putting up a Blackboard link under discussions in order for people to upload their papers there. If for whatever reason Blackboard is giving you a hard time, which is its default is to be dysfunctional, you can always email it. But what I want to do with the book reports is upload them onto a thread, because an assignment, one of your assignments is going to be to comment on one of your peers' book reports. So I want to be able to upload them in that format so everybody has access to everybody else's paper. I know it's a stretch, but also with the book reports, I want to stress the idea that they're pretty cut and dried for the most part. I want to go over just really quickly, because we got a lot to do today. I want to just quickly go over the format, so that there's no, miscomprehension, there's no, cognitive disconnect here about what I'm looking for in terms of the book reports, all right? You can do them in several different formats. They don't necessarily have to be done just as a written paper. And I had already, and those of you who have looked at the guidelines already, and you're not going to wait until, Sunday night to start pecking away at this thing, should know that you've got a couple of different media options, which I hope people will avail themselves of. Because I'd like to see a couple of videos, or I'd like to see a couple presentations, like not unlike what I do here with the lectures, but only better. I'm hoping for higher quality, a higher production values from you guys. It can be done, but you can do it as a written paper, video. You can do it as a video. What do I mean by doing it as a video? You can do it in a way in which you answer all. You might want to read it verbatim with PowerPoints. It might be that kind of report. You might want to just do a lecture on the book. Answering the questions in some kind of PowerPoint form, or you can just do it as a video with like AV material or slides. Maybe bring up some links or whatnot. Option 4 is AV material and slides with a written paper. Maybe you don't want to do a video. Maybe you just want to do a written paper and then shoot me some PowerPoints in conjunction with the paper. Or some AV material, some links to some stuff in conjunction with the paper. Because a lot of the books will lend themselves, a lot of the topics that some of the books will cover will lend themselves to you finding relevant material, online that can connect up with the issues in question. Whether it be whoever's doing their book report on the porn industry, or global or climate change, or economic misdeeds or media bias. That's all like really, really right material for you to find connecting supporting materials for it. All right. So however you want to slice that up. If you don't want to get that ambitious, just do a paper. Just do the paper. All right. But within the contents of that paper, I want to make sure that you are like covering, and you should just do it. The structure of the paper does not have to be really elaborate. You can just I want specific questions answered about this book so that I know that you understand the book, and also for myself, those books which I assigned, which I just have not read, it gives me an opportunity to kind of get up on, this will be your recommendation for the books that I haven't read. I'm going to go on, your recommendations. The first question is, what is the intent of the book? What is the book attempting to do in terms of, is it making an argument? Is it providing us with an experience? Is it calling for certain kind of policies? Is it analyzing? Because most of these books will be analyzing certain social / economic / political issues in certain kind of critical ways. All right, and right from the get-go, I want to know what the book's about. And that's basically, is the book attempting to make an argument, or is it more about objective data? Is it more of just a survey of what is going on? Because some books are quite objective in the ways in which, for instance, they, will cover the history of some phenomena, or just analyze, new research in a way that is more objective. Other books, however, will have a certain slant to them, a certain bent, a certain politics to them, or perhaps some biases embedded in them that you should have the tools to investigate that. All right, because after everything is said and done, this book report is really ultimately a experiment in media research. You're doing research on a book, on a piece of media. What are the credentials of the author? What are the author's credentials? What is his or her area of expertise? Is he an academic? Is he or she an academic? Are they a journalist? Or are they a lay person that just, a lay person meaning just somebody who has firsthand knowledge of what they're writing about. Somebody, might be writing about computer programming, who's a computer programmer, not an academic. Somebody might be writing about, CIA surveillance, who wasn't an academic or a journalist, but was in the CIA. It might be a memoir. There's a lot of different flavors to this, and the books will reflect that. Is it analysis? Is it an analysis or a critique or both? We have to understand the difference between an analysis and a critique, right? An analysis is basically, it is what it says. It's analyzing something. It's parsing something. It's exploring something in some type of intellectual way. A critique, on the other hand, is when somebody takes an issue and is like poking it apart and saying like, what's wrong with this? Not unlike, in the lectures on ideological criticism, how Marx was a critic and critiqued capitalism, and poked it apart and showed it for what it was. Is it about one specific issue or several interrelated issues? If the book is a critical analysis of a situation, does it propose solutions? Are there solutions proposed in the book? Are there initiatives being taken? Does the book give any kind of space to initiatives that are being taken to confront the issue at hand? If it's a problem. Do these solutions seem viable to you? Do the solutions make sense, from your standpoint? No, yeah, I'm jumping all over the place here. Credentials of the author. Is it written by okay. Sources. What type of sources does the author use? Does the author... This also ties in with the methodology part. Does the author use academic sources? Does he or she use journalistic sources? What kind of sources? What kind of data are they getting? Are they going to Joe Schmo's blog and pulling stuff? I doubt that any of the books that I assigned to you guys went to Joe Schmo's blog in order to. You never know. Do they go to other experts and peers? News articles, interviews with experts or people directly involved in the topic under discussion. Do you feel that the author's sources are credible? All right? And if you do, that's not just a yes or no answer. That's a why. That's a, yeah, I do, and this is why. Yeah, I do feel that the author's credentials are, the author's sources are credible, and this is why. This also needs to be thought of in terms of bias, right? And we've talked about bias. All right. Number 4, the methodology. What method or methods does the author use? Remember, methods can be either quantitative or qualitative. Now, I put this question out there also with a disclaimer and a caveat. The disclaimer being that some of the methods that I've listed, it's basically chapter by chapter from the Arthur Berger book. And I know that we haven't gotten into, for instance, things like ethno-methodological research. All right? Knowing that, it's like, the fact that we haven't gotten there yet with some of the different methods shouldn't, you're smart, and you have the ability to, at least get some kind of thumbnail idea of, like, for instance, what participant observation is. We will hopefully be getting into those things, if we've got the time. Do they use content analysis? Do they use surveys? All right. These aren't, things that necessarily, those, to address that question doesn't necessarily assume that you have read that entire chapter and know all the workings of that. A survey is a survey. You know what a survey is, and if somebody's using a survey, you know that. Style. What style does the author use? What points of view does he or she write from? Right? think about the Chris Hedges book. How his chapters are always pretty much this kind of hodgepodge of first person. He usually starts with, an investigation that involves him going somewhere or talking to somebody. But he is very, very present in America the Farewell Tour, all right? Sometimes he's present, sometimes he's not. That's his style. Sometimes he moves into more objective analysis. Yeah, and you'll see that in a lot of different books. So what person, let's go back to ELA, in ninth grade, what person is the author writing in? First person, second person, is the author, is he or she embedded in the book? We could say, like, Hedges is embedded in America, the Farewell Tour. He's there. He literally goes, like, for instance, the chapter on sadism, he literally goes to this, this training session. Are there personal anecdotes? Is the book cool, objective, and dispassionate? Where does it run on the continuum of being like not the author being like not present and not having a opinion? All right, and that is very rare. It's very rare. Like even in the Berger book, which is basically just a textbook and a survey. His person, and don't forget, we're going to be talking to Berger soon, but, we've kind of had a back and forth, and I was telling him, how I enjoyed the book due to the fact that, it could have been very cold and objective in a lot of ways, and his personality is all over it. He infuses, we get a sense of him as a person, dealing with material that is often not dealt with in that way. How objective is it? See bias. Does the book use narrative devices? Narrative devices are what? Just telling a story. Just telling a story. And even Hedges does that. Hedges tells a story. For instance, about how he goes to Scranton, and how he visits Scranton, or how he, goes and visits Newark or Camden, New Jersey. It's like, wherever. That's a narrative. Is it ironic? For whoever's reading Matt Taibbi is kind of, has this penchant for a lot of irony, among other people, including Bongiorno. Does he use literary allusions? I know the Shoshana Zuboff book starts with, passages from I can't remember who the writer was, but literature. Does he use poems? I think she uses poems at the beginning of our chapters. I'm not sure. Sam you would know because you're reading it. Is it humorous? Is the book humorous? Is it emotionally polemical? Does the person get heated up? Do they have an emotional investment? Hedges is often very heated up. We can see, he writes angrily sometimes, about what is going on. He's very aggressive sometimes in his style. Do you get enough of the sense of the author? This is an interesting question. Bongiorno always comes up with interesting questions, but the question of, do you get enough of a sense of the author that you like or dislike him? Or her? Do you like the author? It's like, sometimes it's like, I'll read something and I'll be like, it's a good book, but this guy is kind of a dick. Or I'll watch a blog and be like, hey, this guy, it's like, it's good, the material's good, I don't like him. It doesn't, and that's a sign of maturity too. It's like when you can appreciate someone and not like them. Do you feel that the style is effective for the particular topic? Is the style that the topic is being addressed, is the style that the book is being written in effective? Sometimes it's not, you know. When does the author's style not work? That could be a difficult question. When and the answer to that might be never. The answer to that might be, yeah, her style is always right on, you know. What's the goal of the book? Number 6. How effective do you think the book is in making its case? Does it do what it sets out to do? Does it do what a person just doesn't decide to sit down and spend a year or two or more of their lives knocking something out on a word processor, totally isolated, without wanting to make a case for something. That's usually the intention, or providing us with the data or experience that the author intends. Is it convincing to you? Does the arguments that the author makes, are they convincing to you, or are they unconvincing? And why? And then you got to back that up. Because if you want to go and take one of these books and say, I'm not convinced, then therein lies a task for you to, like, take somebody to task. I know I'm being a taskmaster here, but I think it's very important in these book reports to kind of do a structural analysis. You know, books are always written in a structure. A chapter is always in a certain place within the order of the book, to build a kind of logical, reasonable argument. You know, and the author has to make conscious decisions about how they tell their tale. You know, just like narratives. You know, it's like a narrative like Star Wars doesn't make, you know, it's like if I'm writing like Lord of the Rings and Sauron and we defeat Sauron in like the first book. It's like that doesn't make any sense. You know, I might be a bad analogy, but you know, it's like why is a chapter? What does this chapter do? And why is it there? You know, just a rundown. That should take like no more than a page. You know, no more than a page of boom, boom, boom. Chapter 1, 3 sentences. The author does A, B, and C. Chapter 2, 3 sentences. You know, that's the way that can be laid. If the book is structured in more than 10 sections, break it down. All right, if it's more than 10, break it down. Try to keep it to a page. You know, try to challenge yourself to keep that structural analysis, that chapter by chapter analysis to 1 page. All right. Bias. This is a big one, right? Because some of you are actually reading about bias, and it begs the question: is a book about bias biased? You know, that could happen. Is a book about media bias biased in some way or another? You know, is it biased? You know, in a way that doesn't give any. You know, I mean, sometimes an author or a critic will go after. Even I'm seeing with Berger, he'll go after things and he'll make assertions that I don't necessarily agree with. I want to do something on gangster rap. I like what it's like. I think what he says is interesting about gangster rap. I want to do a blog entry just like that. I was telling the other class, and it applies to this class. Do you feel the author is biased in any specific ways, conservative or progressive? Do they have a grievance? All right, because some of the books that 90% of the books that I assigned, I kind of know what the author is about. There might be 1 or 2 where I just kind of did some research and I was like, yeah, this seems like the best book to cover the topic at hand. And excuse me, and the most recent, you know, all the books that I tried to give you guys are put out within the last few years. Have they been bought off? Just, you know, it's like sometimes people get bought off, you know, but not necessarily the people that we're reading right now. That usually happens in other industries. Despite your own feelings and biases, do you think that the author makes a logical, rational, and strong argument? despite what your politics is, despite what your religious affiliations are, all right? If I was, like, for instance, deeply religious and I was reading a book about atheism, that shouldn't take away from my assessment of the book as making a plausible case for atheism. It's like, it's like people can make really, really good arguments about things that I'm strongly against. Seldom does it happen, but for example, you may totally agree with despite your own feelings and biases, do you think that the author makes a logical, rational, and strong argument? For example, you may totally agree with everything, and on the other hand, the other side of it is this. I might totally be on board with everything that an author says in his or her book, but I might feel that the book isn't very good. I see documentaries all the time where I'm kind of like, yeah, I'm on board with that, but I just don't like it. I just don't think it's a very good documentary. And I can explain why. When I do that, I can explain why. And then your conclusion. What is your overall assessment? Just a concluding paragraph, to address, what your overall assessment is of the book, and that should just get you out, right? Those can be done in 5 pages. This assignment can be accomplished in 5 pages. You may need more real estate than that. You may need 6, 7. You might need 10. Some of you guys like to write. More power to you. You men and ladies like to write. You like to go on about stuff. More power to you. If it turns into 10 pages, it's like more power to you. So that's that. So, I spent, the last 25 minutes going over this in order for us to make sure that we're on the same page with this. Because I know that in lieu of the fact that we're not meeting on Collaborate or any of these other, halls of existential demonic hall of mirrors that they are, this can make sure that we're on the same page with that. So that's that. All right. So those are going to be due on Monday. If you're having problems, once again, contact me. It's like I'm almost ready to flash my phone number, put a little title in the thing to flash my phone number, but I won't do that. Got to get into Freud. We got to get into psychoanalytic criticism, and I can go on, and I got a lot of PowerPoints, so there's a very strong chance that this is going to be a part 1 and a part 2 because there's just so much, and I personally have certain proclivities towards psychoanalysis. I'm kind of a frustrated psychologist in a lot of ways, but I know a lot about the subject, even though I'm a media guy. It's like people would say, yeah, Bongiorno knows a lot about the subject, in fact, even I'll tell you this anecdote some other time. It's but we need to make a distinction between what psychoanalysis is as a discipline, as a therapeutic clinical discipline, as opposed to what we do when we psychoanalyze media, when we psychoanalyze a film or a text or a game even. Those are 2 different animals. That basically psychoanalytic criticism is taking the tools of psychoanalysis that were put together by a group of people that we'll talk about and apply them to reading and critiquing media as such, or different forms of media. And those are 2 different things. And you can't get out of talking about psychoanalysis without talking about the Viennese psychoanalyst. He started as a neuropsychologist. He started as basically a clinician, an MD, who would later change his whole approach on how one deals with mental illness. And his findings would be all things taken aside, what Berger has to say about the role that psychoanalysis plays in modern day life and Freud's position, his kind of shifting reassessment from being one of the great intellectual gods that he probably was to being somewhat criticized. Notwithstanding that, Freud was a genius and prolific as hell in terms of what he comes up with. You may agree with a lot of it, you may disagree with a lot of it, but this man's intellect was prodigious, all right? To the point that Time magazine called him in their top 100 century. They did an issue of Time magazine, and Berger talks about it, where Freud is psychoanalyzing Einstein. You know, I mean, that's where Freud and the pantheon of great historical intellects. You know, what Einstein is to physics and science, and what Einstein is to physics, Freud was to psychology, undoubtedly, indisputably. He played that role. And we're going to talk about him, and we're going to also talk about the work of one of his contemporaries and students by the name of Carl Gustavus Jung, that was a little bit younger than Freud, but once again, with Jung, you know, we're talking about somebody, this prodigious intellect on the level of Aristotle, you know, or Plato, or any of the great, you know, thinkers of history. You know, and Jung, and my personal intellectual endeavors tends to favor the work of Jung far more than Freud, although Freud is very, very influential to me in many ways. Both of them have something to say about the psyche, about the human psyche, and and how it operates, and how it often goes awry, and how one can possibly fix it. You know, and I think that this lecture, and I think talking about these things right now, is exceedingly pertinent due to the situations that the situation that we currently find ourselves in, that is causing a lot of undue psychic disequilibrium and distress, and I'm sure up to and including nervous breakdowns. That people are I have no doubt in my mind that people are being admitted into places like CPAP and crisis centers due to the fact that it's like what we're going through right now is very psychologically and sociologically like excruciating, you know. And I've been talking a lot about it in the other class, and there's going to be a blog. I'm doing a blog entry, another COVID-19 entry that's going to have clips from Dr. Harriet Fraud on it. She's a psychotherapist, and she wants to talk about all of the psychological blowback that's going on due to the pandemic. All right, what's going on in families, what's going on with individuals, you know. So it's like, I think that what we need to say here can be directly applied to, you know, in a certain kind of roundabout way to addressing, you know, the psyche in general. And when the psyche is like put under a lot of stress and what comes out of that, you know. So Freud and Jung they'll be contemporaries, they'll be working together. And we'll talk about the way what causes the break between Jung and Freud, and why that happens, you know, shortly. But I want to talk a little bit about how this all gets started first. How does this whole thing get started? All right. Madness is a thing. Madness as a phenomena, as a social and psychological phenomena, has had a history to it that goes back thousands of years. The ways in which a society treats those people who are psychologically aberrant in some way, and every culture has its own standards and definitions of what constitutes madness, you know. And one of the real great historians of madness was a guy by the name of Michel Foucault, who wrote this himself a prodigious, monumental intellect that works a lot later than these guys. That starts to write about the history of madness and its origins and how different cultures treated madness. Because madness, you know, for the longest period of time, from probably the age of like the ancients, like, you know, from like BC on, from like Greek to Roman civilization and then on through Western civilization, madness, people didn't know what to do with madness. Certainly, it's like, you know, there were Roman emperors that, when we read the histories of them, were indisputably like just bonkers, just fucking bonkers. Guys like Nero and Caligula. And once we start looking at like the 16th and 17th century, royalty, like there was a lot of people that were just nuts. And there was no science to really do anything for them, you know? Especially if you were royalty and no one was going to like mess with you anyway. You would just do all kinds of crazy shit like Caligula did. And who was going to contravene, you know? And then by about the 18th century, the definition of madness changes and we start to see the birth of, for the longest time, it's like, you know, when Uncle Henry went bonkers and started just wandering around the village like naked, you know, thinking that, you know, he was the second coming, they were usually just put away in carceral prison-like conditions, you know, in asylums or worse. You know, it's like the first asylums are probably as bad as the worst prisons because we don't know what to do with them yet. We don't know anything about how the mind operates, how the brain operates, so nothing is done until this movement starts within, and I would chart it to the 19th century, when the rubber really starts to hit the road and clinical medicine starts to address, you know, both on a physiological and on a totally abstract level, this concept of madness. You know, and Freud comes up in a medical culture in Western Europe that is ready and prepared to address the ideas of madness, of what happens to people, how they snap, how they go awry. You know, this is when all these terms start to spring up, like affective disorder or schizophrenia. All these terms start to come about due to the work of these guys, all right? One of the most famous clinics for this type of practice happens in Vienna. And it's not just Freud, it's a whole bunch of guys. And I'm sure women working together to try to understand what is going on. Because every epoch has its own different forms of madness, really. And what we start to see, for instance, in 19th century industrialized Vienna are much different than what we would see before that. Because a lot of this madness would be caused by modernity. You know, there's a lot of work that has been done due to the fact that, you know, modernity and the rise of the industrial culture and modern culture has caused a lot of modern isms, right? And we can say that about our own culture, too. You know, the ways in which our culture now with social media is seeing different types of psychological disorders that have never been seen before. That within each milieu, with its attendant problems of society, we will see different types of things, unhealthy things spring up. You know, and it always like begs the question, you know, what's normal? You know, what's normal in one society, you know, as opposed to and what's healthy. You know, one of the great books that I would strongly recommend is a book that it's almost like a self-help book, but it's not. It's a lot heavier than that. I almost look at it as a kind of mini Bible, and it's by a Hungarian guy by the name of Jurg Kulawin, and it's called From Normal to Healthy. You know, because he wants to make a distinction between being normal, and we know this about we know this already. Being normal and being a conformist isn't necessarily being healthy. Now, isn't, you know? And so we get back to the Viennese clinic. We get back to they're treating just a lot of people that are in really, really bad, just madmen who are being placed in sanitariums, and they want to start to understand how to heal these people, you know, because for the longest period of time, you know, the processes was either, you know, attempting to like literally like, you know, do brain surgery on people that was usually like gruesome and disastrous, you know, or, you know, just locking them away and keeping them from being a danger to themselves and others, you know, and forgotten, you know, but, you know, so that this group comes up and they want to start dealing with things, and they don't want to just deal with it on this neurophysiological level. They start to see that these people can be socialized through without any kind of physical intervention, right? They start to have this model for the mind that goes beyond just what happens between my ears in this organ, right? That the mind is very complex, and it has all of these kind of non-physical, you know, non-sensory elements to it. And they start to realize that they can find modalities of interacting with people to reshape and heal certain things that have happened, that have caused it. They start to find the causes of the madness that isn't necessarily always inherited. You know, they start to think about things like trauma and things like repression and things like actual things that happen in a person's biography that led up to this state of ill-being or not being well. You know, and this is like revolutionary, right? And Freud's whole thing is going to be based on this concept of the unconscious. This concept of the unconscious, right? That at the time that these people start working is very, very controversial and highly contested as to whether such a thing even exists or not. Because when it comes to because it always begs the question, and even today it always begs the question, if something that exists, for instance, in my mind is unconscious, if I have an unconscious and it's this buried aspect of my psychological awareness that I have absolutely no knowledge of, how do we know that it exists? How can we find proof of its actual existence? How does one get to it? It's not like, you know, exploring a cave where, you know, you get an expedition, or exploring a mountain, or even like exploring, you know, for instance, trying to find a cure for a disease. It's like, how did they do it? What they first start to do, and this is why Mr. B does this thing with the watch, is this is a period of time during the 19th century that's very, very fertile for all kinds of movements and fads and phenomena that have to do with psychic phenomena and paranormal phenomena. This is like from the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, all over the United States and Western Europe and everywhere else for that matter. There is all this preoccupation with hypnotism and somnambulism and contacting the dead and seances, and a lot of it is all like just crazy ass bullshit. But a lot of it, you know, this guy named Anton Mesmer, the term mesmerized will come from this man's attempts at hypnosis, of being able to put people in a trance and make by the power of suggestion. This is by the power of suggestion make those people do what he wants them to do. You know, that people become highly. He creates this phenomena in which people are put into a trance and become highly suggestible to conscious dictates. All right. The Viennese clinics, the Viennese school of psychoanalysis starts to see something around this idea that is very startling to them. And what it has to do with is that they start to use hypnosis on people to retrieve information that becomes... They put people in trances and they retrieve information that the person has absolutely no conscious awareness of or has forgotten entirely, and through whatever means they will like verify like this person has no conscious recollection of this happening, and yet it did. They start to corroborate the data, and they're like, hey, wait a minute, there's gotta be this continuum of the human mind where people kind of store stuff and they forget about it, all right? And it will get very, very heavy because they'll start to think about it. It will open up these huge areas of like childhood psychology, what we store, and the idea of the psyche being an iceberg, and the tip of it being an iceberg is not the worst metaphor to use in regards to, once again, we're like, you know, we're coming up with a kind of visual metaphor for something that really doesn't have any kind of visual equivalent, you know, but it gives us, like any kind of model, it gives us a way of understanding it. So that there's this whole idea of the unconscious that they discover through hypnotizing people. Through hypnosis, they find out things, and they start to use it to treat certain types of behaviors that they start seeing, not necessarily in stark raving mad people, but in well-to-do people that have some kind of issue, sometimes psychosomatic. You know, they'll start dealing with not just like hardcore, like stark raving mad people, but people who are not well in some way or another and manifesting symptoms. For instance, Freud would deal with a lot of just well-to-do Victorian-era women that had psychological and emotional problems that they didn't understand. Things like, you know, for instance, there's famous cases of women whose arm would become paralyzed under certain conditions, that they wouldn't be able to move their arm. And there was absolutely no physiological explanation for it. And Freud would dig into this stuff and start to realize what was going on. The only problem with all this, and I know a lot about this, but it's like the problem that Freud had with using hypnosis as a way of getting in touch with the person's unconscious is that he wasn't a very good hypnotist. He wasn't a very good hypnotist. Some people were. Some people in that circle were. Some people weren't. So he's got to find some kind of alternate means of getting people, of being able to get access to people's unconscious. And he'll come up with the idea of what will happen will be momentous. It will be momentous for generations of people and for all of Western culture, right? He's not a good hypnotist. He starts to realize something about unconscious associations that people would make with certain ideas and certain words. When put in a relaxed state, without putting them under, he could use words and associate and this power of the mind to make these associations. He found that this was a kind of avenue into the unconscious that no one had tried before. That people that he could gain access to the unconscious due to people's feelings about a certain word or a certain idea. Hence the whole idea of the psychoanalyst couch, all right? The other way was, there were myriad ways of attempting to do this process of association. One of them was called the Rorschach ink blot test, which was people would make these kind of like just meaningless patterns that Jung will have a lot to say about this. Art itself will be access to the unconscious, we'll find out. But the Rorschach ink blot test would be seminal in attempting to gain access through like associated ideas, and it would turn into this whole kind of science. All right, and so Freud's conception of the human psyche and this whole iceberg metaphor would have to do with this conscious part of the psyche, the things that we're aware of when we're walking down the street or we're talking to somebody. But he also found in his studies that there was this kind of place in between, this place in which the conscious and the unconscious could kind of communicate with each other, and he called that the pre-conscious. Pre-conscious means different things to different people, all right? Some people define the pre-conscious as just shit that we just forget or are just not on the front burner at any given time. We could say, like, for instance, it's like, as I'm giving this lecture, I might have an appointment tomorrow, but I'm not really thinking about that. We can say that that's like pre-conscious stuff. I'm aware of it, but not right at the moment that I am speaking to you, or I'm not rehashing, some trauma that happened a few days, whatever, all right? Or the other dynamic of this pre-conscious thing was just that it was basically this place that, for instance, like memory is a good analogy. How the pre-conscious, like, say we have a dream, all right, and we forget parts of the dream, but it's still there. It hasn't gone totally away because it will pop up again. Like during the day, we'll remember, oh shit, I had this dream last night where, whatever. So it hasn't, gone beyond the pale. It hasn't gone into a place where I don't have access to it anymore. Hence this idea of this kind of spectrum of stuff kind of percolating around that's still kind of there that I haven't buried entirely. All right? But Freud and Jung will put a lot of stock in the ways in which this iceberg, this submerged iceberg, and everything that went on with it had this huge overarching bearing on so much of the things that made up who we were, made up our identity about ourselves, how we felt about love and relationships and our mothers and our fathers and our children and getting acts, and that one of the main objectives for this model of the psyche was that the more that we could get out of that, the more of the stuff that we could mine and bring up into conscious awareness would have this therapeutic quality, because many of the isms, many of the problems, the neuroses and the psychoses and different things that these clinicians were seeing had to do with what would later be called repression or repressed memories that were not properly properly acknowledged in the conscious mind. And Freud was a huge believer in the idea that if we confronted these things that we had buried for whatever reason, that there would be this kind of therapeutic relief, and we would become, more well-adjusted, happier, and more self-aware human beings after certain things, after we had finally, dealt with things, so that this whole idea, and it becomes called the talking cure. It becomes called the talking cure due to the fact that psychoanalysis will usually involve working with a client, and even today, it's like, when you go to see a therapist, when you go to see a counselor, and one way or another, it's like, at some level of the spectrum, whatever that person is doing, whether you're talking to a drug counselor or a marriage counselor, or even in religious counseling, some aspect of Freud and Jung is gonna fall in there. You just can't get away from them. I mean, they were just so epochal, you just cannot get away from them in terms of how it shaped the modern therapy, before we started, going backwards and giving people all these fucking pills. It's like, but this whole idea, and it was monumental, this whole idea that somehow you could heal the wounds of the mind by engaging in, by working through this dialogic process, in order for the person to recognize certain parts of themselves, bring them to awareness, and then deal with them. It was absolutely monumental. And it changed the culture. It just changed the culture. It changed everything we thought about human life. But Freud and Jung will go about this, and here's a couple other different, same thing. This one is just a reiteration of the other one. This one is talking more about Jung. They were both Jung and Freud are pretty much on the same page when it came to the whole mechanism of the conscious. A lot of people bandy about a lot of different. Some people misuse terms and will call the subconscious the unconscious and the preconscious. All we need to know is we just go back. Instead of listening to morons, we just go back to the source. We go back to the guys that did the work, and we use the terms conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. All right, subconscious, whatever, same thing, different terminology. But the difference between Freud and Jung will be that Jung will have a differing opinion about this thing, this layer down here, called the collective unconscious, that we'll have to talk about, that Freud was not on board with. He was definitely not on board with this. Because we'll find out that Freud and Jung had very, very different, would ultimately have very, very different conceptions, different models of what the human being really was, of what the human mind as such was, and would have, as Jung would develop and Freud would develop, they would have a parting of the ways, and we'll talk about why, right? One of the big bugaboos and one of the big controversial elements of Freud's philosophy that Berger talks about was called the Oedipus complex. What was it, all right? Because it's something that people have moronic people, academics who are morons, have a tendency to bandy these ideas around, and people that think they're, hoity-toity people that think they know a lot but don't know shit will bandy around these terms of Oedipal and castration complex without really knowing what they really are. All right, and I'm going to tell you, what it's like. Freud was very, very, and Jung too, were very, very much interested in history and classical art, and Freud would actually be this this connoisseur and this collector of all kinds of art from all around the world, Native American, African art, and so would Jung. But Freud, BU, Binghamton University, probably about 15, 20 years ago, had on display Freud's whole art collection. It was on display over at BU. I went to it. It was like it was excellent, you know. But because he became very wealthy from all this. As a side note, he didn't really just die in obscurity. He just he was pretty well to do, and so was Jung, you know. But they were both like practicing physicians too. You know, these guys weren't just, you know, we have to understand with both Freud and Jung that they weren't just these guys. They weren't navel gazers. They weren't out in some place like just coming up with this shit. They were dealing in clinical situations and sanitariums, and Jung dealt with people in inebriate asylums, alcoholics, right? And a lot of people feel that Jung's findings and what Jung said would form the basis of what we now know as Alcoholics Anonymous. That a lot of the principles of Alcoholics Anonymous are based on the findings of Jung. All right. Once again, this huge section, this huge therapeutic culture, being generated by the thoughts of this guy, by one man, right? Freud read a lot of classical literature, including the Greeks. All of the Greek tragedies and during this period of Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles. He was very interested in the symbols that would pop up in ancient literature and ancient drama, and the story of Oedipus, the king of Colonus, I think it was. I can't remember exactly. Who it's this tale in which he inadvertently I think that he's told by some kind of soothsayer that this is going to happen, that he is going to murder his father and marry his mother, and he does everything within his power to not make that happen. And somehow, due to fate, or the fates, or the furies, or the gods, it happens. All right, he murders his father, and he ends up marrying his mother. And Freud will do a lot with developmental psychology, and he puts a lot of stress on sexuality and what he will call the libido. All right, and he will see these patterns formed in the family that have to do with these instincts that he comes up with a model for it, and he uses the narrative of Oedipus Rex to deal with what he sees in the relationship of the child to the mother and the father, and he sees it as a pattern that recurs. All right, and it isn't a pattern. And people have this people have all kinds of misplaced ideas about what this really signifies. What is significant about this phenomena. That he'll say that there is a triangle that goes on with the child and the mother and the father, due to the fact that the mother and the father and any kind and a nuclear family, that there is this feminine, the mom and the dad and the child, whether male or female. This is beyond gender. Well, depending on the relationship, will have this tendency, this kind of sexual instinct, to want to supersede the father as part of the developmental process. And Freud would go as far as saying that there's this unconscious urge in the child to want to murder the father and marry the mother. All right, and it's crazy on the surface, but then he would say that no one really. It's only like the most psychopathological person would actually go as far as like doing it, but that we would do it symbolically in many, many ways, in sibling rivalry, and the ways in which the father and the son would engage in competition, in certain kinds of competitions, and the ways in which we would relate to our mothers, and this might have been all cultural, but he would see these recurring patterns of the ways in which, and a lot of it has been, there's numerous exceptions to these kind of patterns, all right. But he would see this pattern, and we can see it, for instance, in think about your own relationships. No one wants to really think about it, all right. But I see numerous cases, and even in myself, in my past choices of relationships, looking back at certain relationships that I had with members of the opposite sex, and just recently. I was thinking about somebody, and I was like, holy shit, she was exactly like my mother. That I kept on, we go after different, we keep on repeating these patterns. Sometimes they're dysfunctional. But Freud saw this thing he called the Oedipal complex, and he said that basically part of the therapeutic process was to get people out of that, get people out of what he called an infantile state. He saw sexual he saw the sexual development of people as being part and parcel with their development in all other areas of life. If Marx reduced everything down to economics, Freud reduced everything down to the sexual instinct in a lot of ways. And he would say that was this need to procreate, this need to release this sexual energy would be the primary motive for human beings. And that we would do certain things with it, all right? But that was like this kind of primary drive to release sexual energy. And at some point, he will go as far as saying that it's like civilization as such cannot happen until we take that instinct and we do something with it other than just having sex all the time. It's like and he talks about this idea of repression and sublimation, but he's very, very interested in the child, the psychosexual realm of the child. All right, and it's something, and it was very controversial. It was like people were just. At first, people were just, thought he was fucking crazy. It was just like, how dare you say that the child has sexual instincts? And yet time and time, it's like, but he would start to come up with a whole schema for exactly what was going on, and we'll see that get played out. The Oedipal complex, also known as the Oedipus complex, is a term used by Freud in his theory of psychosexual stages of development. Psychosexual stages of development. Freud would come up with a schema for what he felt constituted a normal sexual maturation process. This maturation process that manifests itself due to our shifts in our thinking in these different stages about our sex organs and about other different zones of sexuality on our body. That we would have to, that some people would go through, would hit a stage and they wouldn't get out of it when they were supposed to. It's all about like unresolved issues right up to like infancy. Like you would pass through infant sexuality, and then you would pass through early this period of being a kid, and then adolescence, and then like post-adolescence, and that there was a healthy way of distributing all that what was primarily psychic energy. We have to get in, and we have to understand that when he talks about the libido, he isn't just talking about the need, the physical act of intercourse. He's talking about the mental energy that we, it's like the libido is mental, all right? We have to understand that, all right? His theory of psychosexual stages of development to describe a child's feelings of desire for his or her opposite sex parent and the jealousy and anger toward his or her same-sex parent. He'll say that plays itself out more or less in every situation, all right? There will be a whole bunch of work that will go on later on to attempt to talk and disprove that, done by a very, very famous philosopher by the name of Gilles Deleuze. And he'll write a book, literally write a famous book in philosophical circles called Anti-Oedipus back in like the 80s. And it would become like very, very famous book attempting to dispel all these ideas that we had about the Oedipus complex. All right, so it isn't a theory that is necessarily not uncontestable, but at the same time, with all Freud's ideas and all of Jung's ideas, there's always something, there's always a holdover from them, that there's always some element of them that does apply in certain situations, you know, and continues to have an effect. Berger will talk about using the how we can use the Oedipus complex to explain a lot of different popular culture, heroes and films, and how people will do Oedipal readings on different, like for instance, there'll be he'll pull out an excerpt from somebody that does an Oedipal reading of King Kong. Movies can be analyzed. Basically the takeaway from this whole chapter is that films and media and books and narratives can be analyzed using the concepts that Freud and Jung, and there's been this huge cottage industry in academia of people doing just that. Cultural theorists doing, readings of different texts through psychoanalyzing, using psychoanalytic models and psychoanalytic ideas to analyze the characters in texts. Because the other thing that we have to recognize is often a writer or a filmmaker will put something out, and that guy's got and he or she will have an unconscious too, and will write a story or do a movie with all this stuff that they didn't necessarily know they were doing intentionally, because to do a psychoanalytic reading of a movie or a book or a piece of music is really to attempt to psychoanalyze the artist for all intents and purposes, of the filmmaker. And what this one guy will say, he says, let me offer an example. In his article, The Fascinating King Named Kong, Mark Rubinstein writes, it should be clearer now, at least, to those who have seen the movie of 1933. The first King Kong, remember, came out in 1933. The story of King Kong has the power to move us the way it does. Why does it have that power? It not only retells certain basic myths of human society and religion, but it also recounts stories of our childhood passions and development. He referred. This is Berger writing about Rubinstein's analysis of King Kong. He'll refer to King Kong as a father figure, and the battle between himself and an ordinary-sized human being, symbolically a child figure, as a struggle to possess a woman, symbolically the mother figure. I think it's a little bit of a stretch doing an Oedipal reading of Kong, but it's there. I've always had an alternate reading of Kong, and I think that Kong is really with the story of King Kong is really about colonialism and immigration, And you know, if you ever want to have a discussion with me about that, it's like, but he says we might also think of the relationship between Luke Skywalker and his father, Darth Vader, in Star Wars, right? And that actually does play out, because in the beginning, it's like, all right, so he doesn't have a thing for his mother, but he unknowingly, I mean, Luke and Leia, in the first Star Wars, which is, episode 4, he has these romantic feelings for the woman that later he finds out is his sister. You know, it's just hard. It's like, I don't want to go there. I don't want to, like, you know, I don't want to elaborate on that. But he will go as far as, and James Bond, he'll say that for those of you who are Bond fans, he'll say that the Bond character, we could read Bond in terms of the Oedipus complex. Not only the films, but the original books that Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond books, he'll say, the hero of numerous books and films, Bond deals with villains who are usually fixated on controlling the world. They tend to be older men, and very powerful men who capture Bond and torture him, but are ultimately defeated by Bond, who then makes love to a beautiful woman. That's kind of the pattern of the films and the movies. The Oedipal aspects of these relationships, Berger says, are obvious. All right, maybe so. All right, so this whole Oedipal reading of James Bond. Many people have played Bond. I pulled out one of the first ones. Sean. There was always this big. Rivalry for a while between the first two James Bonds. The first one was Sean Connery. He was in like the first 6 or 7 films. Then he decided that he had enough of it, or there was a contract dispute. And then another British actor by the name of Roger Moore came in and did like another 7 or 8 films. And there was always this big rivalry between, especially among the Brits, about who was better, Connery or Moore. And then, of course, he would be played by numerous other people. You know, but there were always these hardcore, Sean Connery is Bond. You know, it's like, get people, you know, it's like sports stuff, you know. It would be like that, contentious. But this idea of Bond, we'll just end with this: Oedipal James Bond, and he'll speak specifically about the novels by Ian Fleming. The novels have been regarded as an expression of Fleming's own unresolved infantile psychodrama, something that Fleming had not resolved, that he was projecting into his character, that his character was that Bond was kind of his avatar for unresolved sexual issues. This is what he's trying to say. His excessive fondness for his mother, his hostility towards his father, his generally contemptuous attitudes towards women, and his preference for male companions is being interpreted as a sign of his failure to pass through castration anxieties, and we'll have to talk about that, of the Oedipal phase, to assume a position of genitally centered female-directed sexuality. All right, and we have to talk about that too. How for Freud, this move into maturity involves genitally centered female-directed sexuality. All right, that will become highly contested in lieu of everything from the LGBT community to we'll get into that. Our own view is somewhat different. That is, that the use of phallic imagery, the allusions to the Oedipus myth, and the castration complex fulfill an important signifying role in the Bond novels in respect of the ways in which they play upon, connect with, and reinforce the troubling of sexual difference posed by the, quote, the girl, and articulate these aspects of the novels to the ideological and narrative tensions in relation to images of England and Englishness. All right, and we'll have to get. And I have a tendency to say, yeah, we're going to get into that later on, but we probably won't. But you know what this author is attempting to say, England. It's like the British have a certain cultural style to them, we could say, that he's attempting to address, in terms of a certain kind of sexual stiffness and and whatever. It's like, did I just say, you know what I mean? There is this like stereotype of like, he wants to like look at Bond culturally, and what's very interesting is, and I'll just end with this because we're running over. As far as Freud's theories, Freud also happened to be a cocaine addict. He did a lot of cocaine, all right? It's like, I'm not judging. This is what he did. But a very, very well-known friend of mine, a friend of mine who was very well-known and very smart, and he was a Rhodes Scholar, he once said to me, if you were as repressed, if you lived in in the kind of sexually repressed atmosphere, if you lived in the kind of sexually repressed atmosphere that Freud did, and you did a lot of cocaine, you would think the way he did about stuff. That's all I'm going to say about that. It was an interesting comment, So anyway, we need to definitely pick this back up. There's going to have to be a part 2 of this. But hopefully you're finding it interesting. It's like once we start getting into Jung, that's when it gets a lot more interesting. But it looks like we're going to definitely have to do a part 2 to this. Please work on the book reports. Reach out to me if you're having problems, if you're going to be late, and I'll make sure that I give you guys the heads up and a reminder and let you know where the thread is to upload your papers. I hope everybody is doing well. I know that we are under very, very strange and troubling conditions, and I have not remained unaffected by it. Doing the work and doing the videos and staying on stuff, keeps me, distracted keeps me busy. And cigars keep me busy too. So take care of yourself, folks. We'll see you next time.